Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back into the damp and drafty shadows of the Middle Ages, where you'll notice pretty quickly that the world was unfair by design. Look to your left. Towering castles with battlements and guards pacing along the walls. Look to your right. Crumbling mud huts clinging to the edge of a forest. The difference is so stark, it almost feels like two different planets that just happen to share the same soil. And here's a small reality check. You probably wouldn't survive on either side, but you'd definitely have a harder time if you were stuck in that hut. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because you might fall asleep during this story and share only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, turn off the lights and lie down on your chair or bed, and let's begin tonight's journey together. You trudge along a muddy track, the air heavy with wood smoke and the faint tang of manure. Ahead, a peasant's hut squats low to the ground, its walls made from wattle and daub, sticks woven together and plastered with mud and dung. The roof is a patchy quilt of thatch, leaking in the rain, smoking in the summer, and serving as a playground for rats year-round. Inside, one room does the work of all, a bed stuffed with straw, a small hearth sputtering with whatever scraps of firewood could be scavenged, and a single chest holding all the family's worldly possessions, mostly patched tunics and a rusted pot. You step inside and nearly choke on the smoke because there's no chimney, just a hole in the roof. A family huddles together, children barefoot and snot-nosed, gnawing on dark bread so coarse it might double as sandpaper. The floor is dirt, littered with chicken droppings, and the livestock actually live inside too, since their body heat keeps the family from freezing in winter. If you're unlucky, the pigs snore louder than the father. That's medieval insulation for you. Now, turn your head toward the hill, where the silhouette of a stone castle cuts the sky. You make your way up, your shoes sinking into mud, until suddenly the road hardens into cobblestones, and you're greeted by massive wooden gates reinforced with iron. A portcullis rattles as it rises. Inside, the air smells of roasting meat, perfume, and freshly strewn rushes. Nobles stroll across courtyards in furs and velvet, their shoes pointed like spears and far too delicate to survive in the peasant mud. Servants scurry with trays of food or buckets of water. The Lord's great hall is cavernous, its rafters blackened by centuries of smoke, but its walls hung with bright tapestries that double as insulation and status symbols. Candles drip wax into gleaming holders, and if you squint, you can see stained glass catching the pale sun, splashing colored light onto the flagstones. And yes, there are dogs roaming about, but these dogs wear collars of silver. Here's a quirky tidbit. While peasants often shared a single straw bed with the whole family, noble families sometimes slept sitting up in canopied beds. Not because they liked bad posture, but because lying flat was thought to invite death, or, worse, demons creeping in while you snooze. Medieval people took sleeping with one eye open way too literally. The contrast in construction itself tells you everything about social status. The huts, temporary, flimsy, replaceable, an echo of how peasants themselves were seen, tied to the land, expected to endure backbreaking work, and easily replaced if plague or famine claimed them. The castles, on the other hand, were permanent declarations of power. They weren't just homes. They were fortresses designed to survive sieges, symbols of authority meant to intimidate both enemies and, let's be honest, the peasants who lived in their shadow. Historians still argue whether the majority of peasants ever truly envied the castle life. Some suggest peasants simply accepted the divide as part of God's plan, reinforced by sermons reminding them of their place. Others believe envy simmered constantly, especially during famine, when villagers saw the Lord's pantries remain stocked while their own children wasted away. And let's not forget heating. Peasants had smoky fires that filled their one-room huts with choking fumes. Nobles, meanwhile, installed early fireplaces with chimneys in their halls by the 12th century. The difference was so dramatic that a visitor stepping from hut to hall might think they'd been transported from a cave into something resembling civilization. Well, a very drafty, candle-lit civilization. Here's another small joke to ease the gloom. If you lived in a hut, your chances of having open-plan living were nearly 100%. Not because it was trendy, but because you had no choice. Who needs walls when your cow is basically your roommate? Walking back outside, you feel the weight of inequality in your bones. The castle looms above you, promising protection in times of war, but also serving as a reminder that your labor built its walls and your taxes filled its vaults. Down below, the huts cluster like mushrooms, fragile, temporary, and forever vulnerable to fire, flood, or the Lord's whim. You glance back once more and realize the geography of medieval society was also the geography of inequality, power on the hill, poverty in the valley. The divide was visible every time peasants looked up from their fields and saw the fortress towering over them. It was a daily reminder that their lives were woven into a hierarchy they didn't choose. And yet, amid all this, peasants still carved moments of resilience. They painted the walls of their huts with lime wash to brighten the gloom. They sang songs to make work lighter, and they told stories by firelight that survived long after the castles crumbled. Those mud walls, though fragile, held more laughter than you might expect. By now, you've seen both sides of the divide, the stone and the mud, the permanence and the fragility, the lofty castle and the humble hut. And as you take a last look at both, the question nags at you. If you had been born in that era, would you rather freeze in the drafty glory of the castle or suffocate in the smoky warmth of the hut? Either way, survival was a gamble. You wake to the sound of a rooster crowing, and the first thing your stomach tells you is that you're hungry. For a peasant in the Middle Ages, that hunger is almost constant, like a background song you can't switch off. Breakfast, if you can call it that, might be a hunk of yesterday's coarse black bread dipped into watered-down ale, not exactly a continental spread. You chew, and the bread crumbles like gravel in your mouth because it's been baked with ground-up husks and sometimes even tiny pebbles from badly milled flour. Congratulations, your teeth are now medieval tools for stone grinding. Contrast that with the lord in the castle. He starts his morning with fresh white bread, wheat flour carefully sifted and baked by skilled cooks. His loaf is soft, fluffy, and something a peasant might never taste in a lifetime. Alongside it are cured meats, soft cheese, maybe even a bit of honey. His goblet holds spiced wine because water is too common for noble lips. If you're a peasant looking up from your crust of bread, you'd probably wonder if the nobleman is eating from a different planet. Midday rolls around. For peasants, it's porridge again. Barley, oats, or rye boiled until it's thick enough to stand a spoon upright. If you're lucky, you throw in a few vegetables. Leeks, onions, maybe a carrot. Meat? Forget it. Most peasants only ate meat a handful of times per year, usually on religious feast days when the church or lord handed it out. The rest of the year, protein came from beans, peas, and dairy, if the cow hadn't died from some mysterious cow plague. And if you're wondering whether peasants ever poached the Lord's deer to add venison to the pot, the answer is yes. But if caught, the punishment could range from having your hand chopped off to a quick hanging. Medieval diet tip: crime doesn't pay. Meanwhile, in the Great Hall, the Lord is enjoying what can only be called a medieval buffet. Roasted goose dripping with fat, pies stuffed with venison, trenchers of spiced fish, platters of fruit and nuts imported from distant lands. Ale flows freely, wine is mulled with cinnamon and cloves brought along trade routes from Asia, and desserts like marchpane, a medieval marzipan, sweeten the palate. Even his dogs eat better than peasants, gnawing on leftover bones tossed under the table. There's an old saying that a poor man's dinner was often a nobleman's scraps, except the scraps usually didn't make it that far down the social ladder. Here's a quirky tidbit. Nobles loved extravagant food displays so much that sometimes they'd serve peacocks roasted in their own feathers, feathers carefully reattached after cooking so the bird looked alive. Imagine being a peasant watching this spectacle. You'd think the lords were wizards wasting magic on poultry. As you sit at the castle's table, it's easy to see how meals weren't just about food. They were about status. The more exotic the dish, the higher the prestige. Sugar, for example, was considered a spice, not a sweetener, and was so rare it was basically edible gold. A sprinkle of sugar on your dessert told everyone you had money. Historians still argue whether this love of display was more about actual taste or simply showing off to rivals. Either way, the divide was enormous. Back in the village, peasants have to think about survival in every bite. Winters are hardest. Bread is scarce, vegetables rot in storage, and families dig into salted fish or dried beans. Hunger gnaws at children's bellies until spring planting begins again. And famine, when it strikes, doesn't just mean empty stomachs. It means weakened immune systems, disease sweeping through huts, and sometimes entire villages disappearing. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for instance, left millions dead across Europe, while lords retreated into their castles, rationing their vast stores and waiting out the storm. But don't think nobles were completely safe. Overindulgence often brought its own brand of misery. Gout, known as the disease of kings, swelled noblemen's feet until they waddled like ducks. Peasants might envy the feast, but at least their diet of vegetables, grains, and hard labor kept them leaner and, ironically, often healthier than their masters. A poor man might die of hunger, but a rich man might die from too much cheese. You look at the long table groaning under the weight of food, and then glance at the small wooden bowl in the hut. It's the story of the Middle Ages summed up in one meal. Plenty on the hill, scarcity in the valley. The castle echoes with music, laughter, and clattering goblets, while the hut echoes with stomachs growling through the night. Joke break. If you were a medieval peasant invited to the Lord's table, you'd probably faint just from smelling the roasted meat. But don't worry, you wouldn't be invited anyway. As the candles burn low in the hall, the Lord leans back, belly full, while down in the huts, families curl up still hungry. You can almost hear the whispered prayers for next year's harvest, for rain to fall, and for the Lord to forget a little less when it comes to distributing food. Because in the end, life in the Middle Ages was always measured by what was on your plate, or more often, by what wasn't. You step out into the chilly morning air, and what strikes you first isn't the smell of smoke or manure this time, it's the sight of clothing. Everywhere you look, what someone wears tells you exactly who they are, what they earn, and how much respect they're owed. It's almost like everyone's outfit comes with subtitles floating above their heads. Rich, poor, or don't even look at me unless you want trouble. The peasant's clothing is simple, scratchy, and endlessly patched. Picture a rough wool tunic that goes on every morning, summer or winter, because it's the only tunic you own. Its color? A dull brown, maybe faded green, dyed with onion skins or nettles, if someone had the energy to bother. Wool socks full of holes, leather shoes that fall apart faster than you can fix them, if you even had shoes. Most peasants went barefoot in the fields, their feet calloused like boot soles. If it rained, they just got wet. Medieval waterproofing strategy: hope it stops raining. Now, shift your eyes toward the castle courtyard, where noblemen and noblewomen glide across the stones like peacocks. Furs of ermine and fox drape their shoulders. Silks shimmer in the weak sun, dyed in deep crimson and royal blue, colors peasants never dreamed of wearing. Velvet, brocade, and gold thread turn their garments into walking art displays. Every ruffle, every jewel-studded belt screams, I am rich enough to buy 3 villages just to fund this outfit. Here's the quirky part. Rulers in many kingdoms passed what were called sumptuary laws, which literally told people what they could and couldn't wear depending on their social rank. A peasant caught in silk could be fined, or worse. These laws weren't really about fashion, they were about control. If everyone looked equal, how would you know who to bow to? Historians still argue whether peasants actually cared about these restrictions or if they were too busy surviving to worry about silk robes. But you can imagine the temptation of sneaking a bright ribbon into your drab tunic, just to feel human for a day. The difference wasn't only in materials, but also in what clothing signified. For nobles, garments were like walking contracts. A cloak lined with fur meant you had alliances with fur traders. A gown, embroidered with gold thread, whispered of wealth that stretched across generations. For peasants, a patched sleeve meant one more winter survived, one more hole mended by candlelight. Your clothing was not about identity, it was about survival. And then there's footwear. Nobles wore pointed shoes so long, they sometimes had to tie the tips to their knees to keep from tripping. Imagine trying to plow a field in those. It's like showing up to farm in clown shoes. But those ridiculous shoes were a statement. I'm so rich I don't need to walk anywhere practical. Meanwhile, peasants trudged through mud with either crude sandals or no shoes at all, their feet toughened like leather. Another quirky tidbit. Some nobles powdered their hair with gold dust for feasts. Picture that, peasants shaking lice out of their straw beds while their lords sparkle like Christmas ornaments. If you're looking for contrast, that's about as extreme as it gets. It wasn't only about daily wear, ceremonial occasions widened the gap even further. Picture a wedding. The peasant bride wears the cleanest version of her one tunic, maybe with a crown of wildflowers if she's lucky. The noble bride, layers of silk gowns, jeweled veils, pearls dripping from her hair. The wedding feast mirrors the clothing divide. Peasants nibbling bread and cheese, nobles feasting on swan in golden dishes. Even love looked richer from one side of the fence. And clothing wasn't just a display of wealth, it also worked as armor. Peasants had no protection against cold rains except layers of wool. Nobles wrapped themselves in fur-lined cloaks that actually kept out the damp. To a peasant, winter meant endless shivering. To a noble, it meant showing off the latest imported sable. No surprise that peasants often died younger. Malnutrition and disease loved a body that was already worn down by cold. Historians still debate whether peasants secretly mocked nobles' ridiculous fashions. Some chronicles hint at jokes about shoes longer than daggers and sleeves that could sweep a floor. Humor may have been the only weapon a poor man could wield without losing his head. Here's your quick laugh for this section. Imagine explaining modern distressed jeans to a medieval peasant. They'd probably squint and say, "So, you pay to look poor? Please, come plow my field. You'll get that look for free." As you walk back down from the castle, you can feel the gulf widening again. Clothes in the Middle Ages weren't just fabric, they were walls. They reminded everyone who was born to rule and who was born to serve. And unlike mud on your boots, those walls didn't wash off. You follow the road that leads away from the village and toward a wide training field. And here, the difference between rich and poor becomes more than just visible. It becomes sharpened into steel. On one side, noble sons strut in gleaming armor, their horses pawing at the ground, banners snapping in the wind. On the other side, peasants march in ragged lines, barefoot, clutching whatever crude weapons the Lord decided they should hold. Welcome to the medieval army, half spectacle, half cannon fodder, though cannons won't appear until much later. The knights, as you quickly notice, are practically celebrities of their day. Imagine a medieval influencer, but instead of posting on Instagram, they're jousting in tournaments, flashing their coats of arms like brand logos. Their armor is custom-fitted, polished to a mirror shine, and absurdly expensive. So expensive that some families bankrupted themselves just trying to outfit a single knight. Every piece of plate and chain wasn't just protection, it was a statement. I am wealthy enough to carry a small fortune on my body. The poor, meanwhile, are conscripted. That means you don't choose the war chooses you. When the Lord calls, you drop your plow and pick up a spear. And by spear, I mean maybe a wooden pole tipped with iron if supplies aren't too tight. You march with no training, no armor, and no shoes, hoping your sheer numbers will be enough to terrify the enemy. Spoiler alert, they usually weren't. Here's the mainstream fact. Knights were bound by the code of chivalry, which emphasized honor, loyalty, and the protection of the weak. It sounds noble, right? Except, historians still argue whether chivalry was more of a PR stunt than an actual moral code. On the battlefield, knights often ignored the weak, unless the weak happened to be a noblewoman with dowry money or a rival lord's child worth ransoming. For peasants, the code of chivalry might as well have been written in invisible ink. Step closer to the training ground and you'll see noble boys learning swordplay as young as 7. They're page boys first, then squires, then finally dubbed knights in ceremonies dripping with symbolism. Along the way, they're fed, clothed, and armed by their noble families. Compare that with peasant boys of the same age. They're already behind a plow, tending sheep, or pulling weeds. Their training for war is carrying buckets of water or swinging a hoe, which unfortunately doesn't translate well to dodging arrows. Quirky tidbit time. In some battles, peasants were ordered to carry longbows or crossbows, and these humble weapons sometimes outshone knights completely. The English longbow, in particular, turned commoners into lethal forces capable of piercing armor from hundreds of yards away. Imagine the noble shock when centuries of expensive armor met a simple bowstring and lost. Some knights thought it was downright unfair, like a cheat code in a video game. Yet even with longbows in hand, peasants remained expendable. Their job was to soak up arrows, to tire out the enemy, to die in great heaps that cleared the way for the knights to ride in for glory. And let's be honest, glory was usually reserved for the wealthy who could afford a bard to sing about it afterward. You stand at the edge of a battlefield and the difference stuns you. Knights crash together like metal beasts, banners fluttering, lances shattering, swords flashing in the sun. The sound is deafening, like 1,000 blacksmiths hammering at once. Meanwhile, peasants on foot swarm, stumbling through mud, hacking with axes meant for woodcutting, not warfare. Many don't even last long enough to see who won. Another historical joke for you. If knights were the medieval tanks, peasants were the free trial version of an army, useful for a little while, but don't expect any special features. And let's not forget horses. Nobles rode destriers, war horses trained for years to kick, bite, and trample on command. Each one cost as much as a small farm. Peasants trudged alongside, often carrying supplies for the knights. Imagine being asked to walk barefoot while leading a horse that eats better than you do. Nothing sums up inequality better than feeding a horse oats while you eat barley husks. Historians still debate how much actual fighting peasants did in major battles compared to knights. Some records suggest they were critical in sheer numbers. Others imply they were more like background noise, but either way, they were there, dying in droves, mostly forgotten, while the chronicles celebrated the noble charge. By the end of the day, you can see clearly how war, like everything else in the Middle Ages, reinforced the divide. For the rich, it was an opportunity for honor, plunder, and glory. For the poor, it was another tax, paid not with coins, but with blood. And as you watch the knights gallop past, armor glittering, you can't help but notice the shine of their metal blinds you to the mud and misery beneath their hooves. You follow the bell that rings above town, and it leads you not to market, but to a schoolyard where the Middle Ages split as neatly as a page torn down the center. On the manor side, you step into a bright solar. A clerk in a black gown drills 2 noble children with letters traced on a wax tablet. On the village side, you watch a boy your age bend over furrows, drawing straight lines in soil with a wooden hoe. Same dawn, different lessons. One writes on wax, one writes on earth. The sounds tell the story. From the castle nursery comes Amo, Amas, Amat, chanted like a lullaby. From the fields come the creak of yokes and the slap of muddy water against bare shins. The noble boy copies a neat sentence and dusts the tablet with pounce to set it. The peasant boy copies his father's stance and dusts his hands with soil to grip the handle. If you ever wanted a true definition of curriculum, this is it. Mainstream fact time. Across much of medieval Europe, formal learning flows through the church. Monastic and cathedral schools teach the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, logic, before the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. By the late 11th and 12th centuries, universities at Bologna, Paris, and Oxford gather scholars like magnets, gather iron filings, and the language of nearly all this instruction is Latin. Speak the village tongue in class, and the master raps your knuckles. Think of it as the medieval version of switching a classroom into Latin-only mode. You swivel between worlds. In the manor, a tutor, often a landless younger son who has turned ambition into grammar, maps the known world in colored inks, describing far coasts where pepper grows and silk shimmers. He threads in scripture a little law, estate accounts, hunting terms for the boy, and court manners and French for the girl, because her future is diplomacy at table and quiet power in a household. Down the lane, the peasant girl's schooling is also practical. She learns to brew ale that will not sour, to judge cloth at the market with a pinch and a glance, to keep hens alive through winter, and to bargain hard enough that the day's coins can stretch to Sunday. You slip into a cold stone room at a cathedral school and find a master parsing Virgil with boys who look 10 and sound 40. The desks are rough planks, the air mixes ink, tallow, and someone's cabbage lunch. Rules say Latin only, but now and then a whisper in English or French pops up like a fish taking a fly. The birch rod swishes, and posture snaps straight enough to hold up a steeple. Remember those sumptuary laws from our clothing talk? Even language wears a kind of livery here. Certain words belong to certain ranks, and the accent of your Latin can betray your birth faster than your boots. Quirky tidbit for your pocket. Universities devise the PTIA system. Masters authorize rent-by-the-choir copies of a textbook so students can duplicate them faster. A medieval photocopier run by candlelight. Students cram with florilegia, little gardens of quotations arranged for quick recall so they can bloom on exam day. Meanwhile, in the fields, handbooks are literally hands. If you can count seed, lambs, and days of labor, you pass without parchment. Historians still argue whether literacy in the later Middle Ages spread more widely than once believed. Did parish records, guild account books, and inexpensive devotional sheets lift townsfolk into reading, or did the skill remain chiefly a city and cloister privilege? You watch a peddler hawk woodcut prayer sheets in the square and cannot tell who buys to read and who buys to have them read aloud. Either way, the paper glitters with saints, and hope is legible even when letters are not. In the manor, the day wanders into poetry and numbers. The tutor explains Roman numerals while a steward counts rents with a tally stick. Hazelwood notched for amounts, then split lengthwise so lord and steward keep matching halves. Elegant, low-tech security. In the village, numbers are equally serious but differently shaped. How many eggs survive a jolting cart? How many days until the moon is fat enough for planting? How many hands you need to bring in hay before a storm? Your mind toggles between abacus and apron, ledger and lambing. Light joke break. University disputations can run so long that students hide snacks under their robes. If you think modern lectures drift, try debating, do angels understand future contingents? Without a coffee break. And yes, Someone still asks for a summary at the end. The noble path branches toward law, theology, or, if you are fortunate and well-connected, royal administration. Education becomes a ladder rising above muddy fields. The peasant path branches toward apprenticeship. A village boy with quick fingers might join a carpenter, tanner, or mason. He learns by doing. 7 years of sanding, scraping, and stitching, sleeping under a bench that doubles as both dormitory and filing cabinet. When he finishes, he is a journeyman, literally a day worker, traveling with his tools and a letter of recommendation tucked like a passport into his pouch. Another small laugh for the road. Medieval tuition often looks like errands. Copy this page, grind this ink, fetch this firewood. Congratulations, you just paid your fees in elbow grease. Honestly, it beats student loans unless you count the interest charged by your sore back. Remember chivalry from the training field? Knights vow to protect the weak, but the classroom shows another kind of shield, the safety of reading before signing. A peasant makes a cross because that is the only mark he owns. A noble reads the fine print and adds 3 demands. Education is armor. It just does not clang. Evenings echo the divide. In the castle, a mother teaches psalms to a soft-voiced melody, while a clerk illuminates a family book of hours with fat blue initials. Down the lane, a mother tells a tale about a clever fox and a tricky miller. Oral literature is a library without shelves. Memory becomes the village archive. That is why songs stick and jokes survive like seeds dropped in a plow furrow. Fringe-ish tidbit to close. In the margins of some school manuscripts, bored students doodle knights fighting snails. No one fully knows why. Satire on slow bureaucrats, a joke about stubbornness, or just the medieval version of drawing dragons during math. Whatever the meaning, it proves that even in strict schools, boredom breeds art. Somewhere, a master confiscates a snail and assigns extra declensions. By candle end, you understand how the divide renews itself. Noble children inherit tutors, books, and languages that open doors. Poorer children inherit tools, seasons, and the patience to work through them. One is trained to write history. The other is trained to be mentioned in it as the people. You feel the hush of the schoolroom and the hush of the field at dusk, and both are beautiful in their own ways. One in polished Latin, the other in the grammar of weather. But only one grants the right to put your name in the ledger rather than your body in the labor. You drift back toward the great hall of the castle, just in time to hear the steward call for supper, and here the gulf between rich and poor becomes so theatrical you could almost sell tickets. The hall is lit by dozens of tallow candles, though their smoke still lingers like fog against the rafters. Nobles file in, robes swishing, jewelry glinting, their dogs snapping at scraps underfoot. The table is already bending beneath trenchers of white bread, steaming joints of beef, pies thick with venison, bowls of dried fruit and almonds, and goblets brimming with spiced wine. Slide back down into the village, and supper looks like a wooden bowl of pottage. The catch-all stew of peas, beans, and onions simmered so long it's half gruel, half memory of vegetables. Maybe, if the day was good, there's a slice of bacon dropped in, and the family will talk about it for a week. By the way, if you're wondering what dessert is, it's usually just more bread, unless you're noble. Here's a mainstream fact. Medieval banquets were not just meals, they were political theater. The seating order displayed alliances, the dishes showed wealth, and the leftovers demonstrated generosity, or stinginess. A lord who didn't offer second helpings risked whispers among his vassals. Food was power, and the feast was a performance. Meanwhile, in the hut, food was survival. Peasants ate what they could grow or barter: cabbage, leeks, beans, rye bread, occasionally cheese, rarely meat. A child's best hope for sweetness came from apples in autumn, or a bit of honey if a wild hive was found. And famine years reduced the menu to bark bread, literally flour mixed with ground tree bark, chewy enough to make your teeth weep. Quirky tidbit for you, bees sometimes dined on swans, cranes, or even porpoises. Yes, medieval lords thought sea pork was a delicacy. Imagine peasants watching smoke rise from the castle kitchens while they gnawed on barley crust. Talk about salt in the wound, though, ironically, salt itself was so expensive that peasants rarely saw it. You take a seat on the edge of the high table and notice the entertainment. A jester tumbles, a minstrel strums a lute, servants carry in gilded dishes with peacocks dressed back in their feathers to impress the guests. Every bite of roasted bird is a statement. I can afford to waste. The lord lifts a goblet and toasts, wine spilling down his chin, and everyone laughs. Down in the village, entertainment is conversation. The family sits around the hearth, telling stories or singing work songs. A neighbor might drop in with a tale about a fox that outsmarts a priest or a miller who cheats at measuring grain. The humor is earthy, sometimes bawdy, often repetitive, but it knits the community together. No gilded peacock required. Historians still argue whether nobles genuinely enjoyed their elaborate food or simply used it to flaunt power. Some suggest the heavily spiced dishes were more about masking spoiled meat than savoring flavor. Others think nobles had such jaded palates that only spectacle could keep them amused. Either way, the extravagance contrasted so sharply with peasant hunger that resentment simmered almost as fiercely as the stew. Joke break. Imagine a peasant sneaking into a banquet, grabbing a roasted swan and being asked, "How would you like that carved?" Answer, "Quickly, before you catch me." Even table manners tell the story. Nobles used knives and spoons, wiping fingers on expensive cloths, or even on their hunting dogs, while peasants shared a single wooden bowl, scooping with hands or crusts of bread. The trenchers of nobles were actual loaves carved flat, then discarded to the poor or given to servants. For peasants, trenchers were not plates, they were dinner. You glance back and forth and realize that meals in the Middle Ages were mirrors of inequality. Nobles consumed abundance not just for sustenance, but for spectacle, while peasants consumed the bare minimum for survival. One side measured portions in status, the other measured in hunger. By the time the castle hall falls quiet, the noble guests are dozing against cushions, bellies round with meat and wine. Down in the huts, the family curls together on straw, stomachs never fully satisfied, whispering prayers that tomorrow's harvest will not fail. And in both places, sleep comes, but in one, it's heavy with wine, and in the other, it's light with hunger. You wander outside again, and this time, the difference between rich and poor hits you not in the stomach, but on the skin. Hygiene, or what passed for it in the Middle Ages, divided classes as neatly as a moat divides a castle from the swamp around it. Step into the manor, and you find a noblewoman reclining in a wooden tub lined with cloth to prevent splinters. Hot water is poured by servants, scented with herbs like lavender or rosemary, maybe even a pinch of expensive spices for that "I can literally bathe in money" aroma. Soap, when used, is made with animal fat and lye, and sometimes perfumes from far-off lands arrive in tiny vials worth more than a peasant's cow. The nobleman lowers himself into the bath, sighs with pleasure, and later pats dry with linen towels. For him, cleanliness is comfort and a chance to show off wealth. Now step into the village stream, where a peasant woman kneels, scrubbing clothes against rocks while the water numbs her hands. If she's lucky, she might dunk herself too, fully clothed, because modesty and cold air aren't a great mix. Soap is rare, so ash mixed with water often does the trick, though trick might be generous. Mostly, peasants rinsed dirt away with cold water, then went back to sweating in fields. And since baths took time, most peasants bathed maybe a few times a year. Yes, a year. Deodorant? Try dried herbs tucked under your tunic and hope for the best. Here's the mainstream fact. Medieval public bathhouses existed in towns across Europe, and both rich and poor sometimes used them. But they became controversial. By the 14th century, the church often frowned on them for being associated with immorality, or, during plague years, for supposedly spreading disease. Historians still argue whether bathhouses actually vanished because of moral panic, or simply because hot water and firewood were luxuries too costly for ordinary townsfolk. Quirky tidbit: some nobles went to extremes, like Elizabeth of Hungary, who reportedly bathed daily, an eccentricity at the time. Meanwhile, King Louis XIV of France, a bit later than the Middle Ages but still relevant, supposedly boasted he only bathed twice in his life. The medieval world was inconsistent. Some washed too often for their neighbors' liking, others not nearly enough for ours. Clothing maintenance shows the same divide. Nobles sent linens to laundresses who boiled them, bleached them in sunlit fields, and returned them snowy white. Peasants had one set of underclothes, maybe two, washed until threadbare. The smell in a hut full of humans, chickens, pigs, and wet wool, let's just say medieval candle, wouldn't sell on Etsy. Inside the manor, perfumes and pomanders dangle from belts, releasing sweet scents to cover natural odors. A nobleman might wear gloves perfumed with ambergris or musk, a flex that silently says, "I can afford to smell like an exotic animal product shipped halfway across the globe." Peasants, on the other hand, relied on smoke from their hearth fires to mask human odors. If your tunic smelled less like sweat and more like smoke, that was considered a win. Joke break: peasants didn't need cologne ads. Their motto could have been, "Eau de turnip," because it's all you've got. And water itself was a dividing line. Nobles had cisterns and wells inside castle walls, ensuring safer, cleaner supplies. Peasants drew from streams, ponds, or communal wells, often shared with animals. Illness from contaminated water was common, though it was often blamed on bad air instead of germs. Peasants drank watered-down ale daily because boiling grain for brewing killed some bacteria. Though they didn't know that part, they just knew it kept them from dying as often as plain water. Historians still debate whether peasants were truly filthy or simply normal by the standards of their time. Some argue they bathed more often than stereotypes suggest, at least in rivers during summer. Others point to complaints from nobles about peasant stench as proof the divide was real. But even if peasants scrubbed regularly, they could never compete with the luxury of perfumed baths inside stone walls. The sensory contrast is unforgettable. In the castle, lavender, beeswax, and roasted meats mingle in the air. In the village, dung, sweat, and wood smoke define every breath. Nobles glide past, powdered and perfumed, while peasants shuffle by, stained and reeking of labor. And yet, here's the irony: peasants' constant exposure to dirt and cold may have given them stronger immune systems than nobles pampered behind their scented walls. So the question lingers: would you rather smell of rosemary but risk gout in a gilded tub, or stink of sweat and smoke but at least feel alive in the fields? Either way, the nose never lies in the Middle Ages. You walk into the heart of a bustling medieval town just as a trial is about to begin, and immediately the air shifts. Justice here is not blind. It squints very carefully to check your social rank before swinging its gavel, or more likely, its axe. Nobles and peasants do not stand equal before the law. One side receives pardons wrapped in parchment, the other receives lashes wrapped in rope. Picture this: a noble accused of cheating his vassals out of grain rents. The court gathers, the accusers tremble, and then the noble's steward produces a fat purse for the judge, who suddenly remembers the importance of mercy. The punishment? A fine, perhaps, or a token pilgrimage as a lesson. The noble departs with his lands intact, maybe a little embarrassed, but still seated comfortably at the high table that evening. Now, turn your gaze to the village stocks, where a peasant accused of stealing a loaf of bread is already locked in by his neck and wrists, jeered at by neighbors who secretly sympathize but dare not say so. Hours in the sun or rain, insults hurled, sometimes stones too. For a second theft, the punishment sharpens, flogging, mutilation, or even hanging. Injustice isn't just obvious, it's advertised in the middle of town square. Here's the mainstream fact: medieval law codes were stratified by rank. In Anglo-Saxon England, for example, the weregild system set the price of a man's life, literally a fine paid if someone killed him. A noble's life could be worth hundreds of shillings, a peasant's maybe a handful. Historians still argue whether this was meant as deterrence or simply as a blunt reminder that not all lives were weighed equally. Quirky tidbit: nobles could sometimes invoke trial by combat, yes, the Game of Thrones style duel, to prove their innocence, because clearly God would never let the guilty party win. Imagine peasants trying that. "Your Honor, I demand a duel." The judge would laugh, then probably hang them for cheek. Peasants, instead, often endured ordeals. Trial by water meant being tied and thrown into a pond. If you floated, you were guilty because water rejected you. If you sank, you were innocent, but possibly also dead. Trial by fire meant carrying a red-hot iron or walking over coals, then waiting days to see if your burns healed miraculously. Somehow, nobles rarely volunteered for these methods. Step inside a manorial court, and you see justice at its most mundane. Villagers gather as the steward presides over cases of stray pigs, boundary disputes, and unpaid rents. The lord's interest is less about fairness and more about ensuring his property and taxes remain intact. The peasants know the game. Sometimes they settle grudges by dragging each other before the steward, knowing the outcome will depend more on favor than fact. Now climb into the stone hall of a royal court. Here the king's justices wear robes, records are written, and lawyers begin to appear, speaking in Latin and French. The noble accused stands with counsel, while the peasant defendant can barely follow the language. Law becomes a performance, and only those fluent in parchment and privilege have a chance of winning. Joke break. Trial by water basically said, if you drown, congrats, you're innocent. It's like the medieval version of a bad return policy. Satisfaction guaranteed, or your life back. The divide extended even into prisons. A noble might be held in a comfortable tower room, with servants allowed to bring food, books, and bedding. A peasant rotted in a damp dungeon, shackled, gnawed by rats, disease spreading faster than gossip. Survive the dungeon, and you might still emerge too weak to farm, which is its own death sentence. And yet, justice wasn't purely arbitrary. There were cases of nobles executed, rebels, traitors, rivals too dangerous to leave alive. But even their executions were spectacles, often by beheading, swift and relatively dignified. Peasants were hanged, burned, or broken on the wheel, their deaths messy and meant as warnings. The same crime, different endings. Historians still debate whether medieval people themselves saw this inequality as unjust or simply the way of the world. Religion often reinforced it. Preachers taught that earthly suffering was balanced by heavenly reward, so peasants accepted harsher punishments as part of their lot. But acceptance doesn't mean ignorance. You can feel the resentment simmering in village gossip, in secret ballads mocking lords, in riots that occasionally erupted when oppression grew too heavy. By the time you leave the square, the lesson is clear. Medieval justice is not carved in stone, but carved in class. The noble escapes with a fine, the peasant pays with his skin. The gallows creaks in the wind, and you realize the law, in this era, is less about right or wrong than about who you are and how much you can pay to bend it. You follow the scent of herbs drifting from a small hut on the edge of the village, and the door creaks open to reveal a peasant woman bent over bundles of dried plants. She grinds roots with a mortar and pestle, muttering charms as she sprinkles powder into a steaming pot. For peasants, medicine in the Middle Ages is equal parts herbs, prayers, and a dash of luck. A fever might be treated with willow bark tea, wounds with cobwebs pressed into the flesh, and stomach pains with mint or fennel. If that doesn't work, you try a charm. Tie a saint's relic around your neck, whisper a prayer, and hope the sickness listens. Now cross the drawbridge into the castle. Here, the nobleman summons a physician, sometimes trained in the medical schools of Salerno or Montpellier. These men consult heavy manuscripts bound in leather, filled with theories from Galen and Hippocrates. They prescribe diets, bleeding, and purges to balance the humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Noble patients sip expensive imported syrups or rest on feather beds while leeches dangle from their arms like unwelcome jewelry. The treatment might not work any better than the peasant's charms, but it looks more impressive. Here's a mainstream fact. Medieval medicine relied heavily on humoral theory, the idea that health was a balance of bodily fluids. A fever meant too much blood, so bleeding was ordered. Melancholy meant too much black bile, so purging or warming foods were recommended. Historians still argue whether this system helped at all or merely provided a placebo effect. Quirky tidbit: some nobles swallowed powdered gems, yes, ground up emeralds or sapphires, as medicine. The logic was that precious stones carried healing virtues. In reality, all they probably got was expensive kidney trouble. Meanwhile, peasants chewed garlic and onions to ward off disease, which at least had some antibacterial properties. The irony? The low cure worked better than the high one. Step into a monastery infirmary, where monks treat both poor and rich. Shelves are stacked with jars of herbs, and gardens bloom with sage, rue, and thyme. Monks copy medical texts in Latin, preserving ancient knowledge. Peasants sometimes sneak in hoping for charity care, but nobles fund entire wings of the infirmary and thus receive the best attention. Even in the house of healing, rank decides priority. The sensory divide is striking. In the castle, a sick room smells of beeswax candles, rose water, and clean linen. In the peasant hut, illness mixes with dung smoke, damp straw, and the sour reek of sweat. One patient groans on embroidered pillows, the other coughs into the dark until dawn. Joke break: if you were a peasant, your doctor might say, "Take 2 leeches and call me in the morning." Problem: you can't afford leeches, and the morning might not come. And then there's the Black Death, sweeping across Europe in the 14th century. Nobles fled to country estates, hoping distance would protect them. Peasants had nowhere to flee, so entire villages died. But disease didn't respect class lines. Nobles with their expensive remedies perished alongside peasants with their garlic charms. The difference was that nobles had chronicles written about their deaths. Peasants were buried in mass graves with no names remembered. Historians still debate whether medieval people realized how ineffective many treatments were. Some argue they clung to humoral theory out of tradition. Others suggest they recognized herbs and folk remedies worked better, but lacked the authority to override scholarly medicine. Either way, the divide remained: nobles with physicians, peasants with wise women. The inequality of care runs deeper than medicine. It's about time. A noble can afford to lie in bed for weeks, tended by servants. A peasant cannot stop working even when sick. If you can't plow, you can't eat. Many simply worked through illness until their bodies gave out. By the time you step back into the fresh air, you realize health in the Middle Ages was less about the strength of your body than the strength of your purse. Nobles swallowed jewels and hired doctors. Peasants chewed herbs and whispered charms. Both hoped for healing, but only one side could afford to keep trying when the first cure failed. Your feet carry you along a muddy lane after rain, and suddenly you notice the difference beneath you. For peasants, the road is mud, plain and simple. Your bare toes sink into the muck, every step squelching, leeches clinging, and filth soaking into calloused skin. Travel means aching legs and ruined feet, and distance is measured not in miles, but in blisters. Now, glance up the hill, where a nobleman trots past on a sleek destrier, its hooves striking rhythm on a paved courtyard before splashing mud onto those below. His boots are made of fine leather, his stirrups polished, and a servant jogs behind carrying his cloak so it doesn't touch the dirt. For him, the world is a smooth ride, each journey cushioned by saddles and horsehair padding. Here's your mainstream fact. Horses were not just transport, they were symbols of rank. Nobles bred and trained different kinds. Destriers for war, palfreys for travel, coursers for hunting. A single destrier could cost as much as a village's yearly output. Peasants, by contrast, relied on their own 2 feet, or, if fortunate, a plodding ox hitched to a cart. Even donkeys were luxuries for some households. Quirky tidbit, nobles often shod their horses with iron shoes, but peasants couldn't always afford nails for their own carts, let alone horseshoes. Some walked barefoot their whole lives, feet toughened into natural boots. Travelers from abroad sometimes marveled, or recoiled, at peasants who strode across stones with no wince at all. Their calluses were like leather soles you couldn't remove. The sensory difference is immediate. When a noble rides by, you smell leather, hear jingling harness bells, and see embroidered saddlecloths glinting in the sun. When peasants walk, you hear slaps of wet feet, smell damp wool, and see mud streaked up to their knees. And if you wonder how far each can go, well, the horse eats oats and rests in stables. The peasant eats crusts and collapses on straw. One travels with banners, the other with blisters. Historians still argue whether medieval roads truly were impassable or if chroniclers exaggerated. Some stretches were maintained for royal armies, but most village tracks turned to sludge in winter. For nobles, this hardly mattered. They had the height of horseback. For peasants, it meant isolation. A sick villager might never see a market town simply because the road swallowed their feet. Joke break. In the Middle Ages, peasants invented the mud spa treatment, except it wasn't optional, and it came with blisters. And travel meant more than movement, it meant opportunity. A noble could ride 20 miles in a day, conduct business, return home to supper. A peasant might take 2 days to reach the same distance on foot, losing valuable work time and possibly getting fined for neglecting the fields. Nobles journeyed with retinues, guarded and fed. Peasants risked bandits on lonely paths with nothing to offer but the shirt on their backs. Picture pilgrimage. A noble rides toward Canterbury with servants carrying supplies, banners fluttering, and inns eager to host him. A peasant trudges the same route, sleeping in barns or under hedges, shoes worn through, begging for crusts from monasteries. Both claim the same blessing at the shrine, but only one arrives without bleeding feet. And then there's war again. Knights thunder into battle on war horses that bite and trample as effectively as their masters swing swords. Peasants stumble behind, burdened with packs, sometimes carrying spears, but often just serving as walking supplies. If retreat comes, the nobles spur horses and vanish. Peasants, stuck on foot, are cut down. Feet versus hooves is not a fair contest. Another quirky tidbit, nobles sometimes used traveling litters, essentially covered stretchers carried by men or mules. Imagine reclining like Cleopatra, while peasants literally carry you over mud. If ever you needed proof of class divide, it's one body resting, while 2 sweat to haul it forward. By the time you wipe mud from your ankles, the image is clear. In the Middle Ages, your means of movement was your measure of freedom. Nobles floated above the mire on horseback, while peasants sank into it step after weary step. The tracks they left behind tell the story. Hoofprints for the rich, bare footprints for the poor. You leave the rutted road before dawn and slip under oaks where the air tastes of pine and iron. A horn sounds ahead, deep, proud, impossible to mistake. For nobles, mourning in the forest is sport. For peasants, mourning in the forest is risk. The noble hunt assembles like a parade. Hounds quiver, muzzles testing the breeze. Men and women in rich cloaks ride palfreys, gloves stitched with pearls, hawks hooded like dignitaries asleep. A master of the hunt lifts a hand and the pack surges. You hear whoops, branches cracking, the liquid music of hounds in full cry. Down the slope, a boy works quickly. His snare is a loop of cord set where rabbits have worn a path. He knows the warrens, the hedges, and the places where deer leave slots like signatures in mud. He also knows the penalties. Forest law is a net as real as his snare, and kings hold the rope. Here's your mainstream fact. By the 12th century, forest law in England protected game and trees with separate harsh courts. Poaching, cutting certain timber, or even carrying a bow in prohibited zones could bring ruinous fines, imprisonment, or mutilation. Across much of Europe, boar, stag, and swan were noble preserves. Peasants were pushed toward fish, rabbits, or simply hunger. Quirky tidbit time. Falconry manuals matched birds to rank. Eagle for an emperor, peregrine for a prince, merlin for a lady. Some hawks wore tiny bells engraved with their owner's motto. A few enjoyed heated perches in winter. Try telling a hungry villager the bird eats better than he does. Medieval priorities. Feathered athlete first, you second. Ride a little with the nobles. A horn calls. The stag breaks cover like a brown comet. Ground shakes beneath hoofbeats. A knight leans, looses a boar spear, and the forest erupts. Pages shout. Dogs bay. Someone laughs, the glittering laugh of a person certain the world exists to entertain him. The kill will be parceled by custom. Choicest cuts for the Lord's table. Ritual portions for the hounds. A token to favored servants. Down in the village, cauldrons will not smell of venison. Meanwhile, the boy's snare whispers shut. A rabbit means stew. It means a mother smiling for the first time in days. He slips it into his cloak, only to freeze as a forester's dog pads into view. Nose working. The forester steps from the shade, staff in hand, livery marking him as the forest's policeman. You feel the boy's choice thump in your chest. Run and risk worse, or beg and risk humiliation. He tries a third way. He offers the rabbit for the man's pot and hopes mercy has a taste. Historians still argue whether forest law was uniformly brutal or often bent by neighbors who knew hunger's face. In some places, foresters looked away for a coin, a favor, or pity. In others, examples were made so fear could travel farther than any judge. Surviving records show both stories. The sensory divide keeps unfolding. Nobles drink spiced wine from travel flasks. Peasants dampen cracked lips with stream water cupped in dirty hands. Nobles talk bloodlines of hounds. Peasants talk blight and the lean fox that keeps stealing hens. When nobles hawk along the river, a heron rises like gray smoke, and a falcon streaks after it, the two birds writing a fierce sentence in the sky. When peasants fish without permission, they hide their lines at the first crunch of boots. Joke break. The forest court is basically medieval Yelp. Every review is 1 star and ends with, "Would not poach again." Step into the hunting lodge, standing like a wooden crown among beeches. Inside, skewers spit and hiss. Someone carves trenchers, as if abundance were a birthright. The walls wear antlers like medals from a game no one else was allowed to play. On a shelf sits a book of tallies, days hunted, beasts taken, guests entertained, fines collected. Further downslope, supper is nettle pottage. Add a leek, and it feels like a holiday. Someone traps a brace of songbirds and bakes them into a tiny pie. Yes, small birds were eaten. Yes, it took patience bordering on desperation. Another neighbor finds mushrooms after rain and debates whether they are the good kind. A third stretches flour with ground acorns. Remember that open-plan living from the huts? This is the open-plan pantry, whatever the hedgerow offers, if it offers at all. Another quirky detail, rabbit warrens were sometimes enclosed coneygarths with their own keepers, and stealing from them could be treated like breaking into a vault. Also, on certain rivers, swans bore notched beaks, swan marks, to show ownership. In a world where even birds carry paperwork, freedom feels like a rumor. Yet the forest isn't only a theater of privilege, it is also a commons of knowledge. Peasants read woods the way clerks read Latin, the cleft of a hoofprint, the height of nibbled twigs, the calendar of mast years when oaks drop fat acorns. Children learn which leaves soothe stings and which berries pretend sweetness but make you pay later. Those skills keep bodies alive through winters that do not care about law. Joke break number 2. If chivalry is a knight's code, poaching is a stealth game. Crouch, crawl, cook quickly, and never boast to the guy who drinks too much at the alehouse. By dusk, horn calls fade. The nobles ride back victorious, already planning tomorrow's chase. The boy slips home by hedges, a quiet shadow with a dented pot waiting. He will skin the rabbit behind the cottage, bury the fur where dogs cannot find it, and lie if anyone asks where the bones came from. From luck, he will say, and he will not be wrong. As you leave the trees, you recognize the rule that governed so many rules. The rich turned nature into privilege. The poor turned it into hope. One class tasted the forest as entertainment, the other as calories. The difference is the distance between a silver horn and an empty stomach, measured in laws, in fear, and in the soft thump of a snare closing at dawn. Joke break number 3. Nobles claim the forest improves the character. Peasants agree. Nothing improves character like sprinting when a forester yells. You step back onto the lane, hearing wind in leaves and a far-off dog. If rain comes tonight, tracks will wash away. The pattern won't. Hoofprints above, bare footprints below, and rabbit paths threading between. Small, risky lifelines stitched into a landscape owned by someone else. The day stretches long now, and you notice the split not in food or fashion, but in hours themselves. Time is carved a day differently depending on whether you sit in a castle or toil in a field. For nobles, leisure is a pastime. For peasants, leisure is almost a myth. Start in the village. The rooster crows, and you rise before dawn, stumbling into fields still wrapped in mist. Work is dictated by the seasons. Plowing in spring, sowing in summer, harvesting in autumn, repairing tools in winter. The rhythm is relentless. Dawn to dusk, 6 days a week, with Sunday for church. Your body is the clock. When your back aches, it is noon. When you can't see the plow, it is night. Leisure? Maybe a stolen song at the tavern or a festival on a saint's feast day, but otherwise, every breath is duty. Now, ride up to the castle. After a late breakfast, nobles stroll in gardens, hawk along rivers, or gather in halls for chess, backgammon, or poetry. Minstrels sing ballads of love and war. Ladies embroider with silk so fine, peasants would sell a cow just to buy the thread. In the afternoon, some nobles hunt. Others practice falconry or play dice games. And in the evening, music and dancing stretch late into the night by torchlight. Here's your mainstream fact. Chess became wildly popular among the nobility of medieval Europe, introduced through Islamic Spain. Its symbolism of kings, queens, bishops, knights, and pawns mirrored the medieval hierarchy itself. Historians still argue whether peasants ever played simpler versions with stones on boards scratched in dirt, but in castles, the game became a metaphor for strategy, power, and privilege. Quirky tidbit: nobles sometimes staged living chess games, with servants dressed as pieces, moving under the orders of their lords. Imagine being a human pawn. You literally embody your social rank, expendable in a noble's game. A peasant might laugh bitterly at the accuracy of it. Walk back down, and you'll find peasants finding joy in simpler ways. After sunset, families sit around the hearth, telling folk tales, riddles, and songs. The alehouse is the village's living room, where neighbors drink weak ale, share gossip, and occasionally break into wrestling or dice. Work songs fill the air during harvest, and dancing erupts at festivals, often with fiddles or bagpipes. Leisure exists, but it is communal, fleeting, and always edged by exhaustion. The sensory divide is striking. In the castle, lute strings pluck soft notes, while perfumed torches smoke sweetly. In the village, rough fiddles squeal, mugs thud on wooden tables, and laughter competes with coughing from smoky hearths. Nobles dance in silk slippers. Peasants stamp barefoot in mud. Joke break. For peasants, a rest day means working only half as hard. For nobles, a rest day means inventing a new game to keep from being bored. Religious festivals narrow the gap briefly. On feast days, both lords and villagers join processions, sing hymns, and share in celebrations. But even then, the divide peeks through. Nobles host jousts and tournaments. Peasants crowd the sidelines. The same bells ring for all, but the echoes carry differently into stone halls and straw huts. Historians still debate how much leisure peasants actually had. Some argue the agricultural calendar left slack in winter, giving villagers more downtime than modern assumptions allow. Others claim survival tasks, mending, spinning, chopping wood, filled every gap. Either way, nobles' leisure was choice, peasants' was accident. Another quirky tidbit: some nobles kept trained dwarfs, jesters, or even pet monkeys for amusement, while peasants found joy in contests of strength, foot races, or village plays. Both sides laughed, but one laughed over sugared almonds, the other over spilled ale. By dusk, the contrast is plain. Nobles stretch across cushioned benches, rolling dice, drinking wine, and calling for more music. Peasants collapse into straw pallets, humming lullabies as children drift to sleep. One class escapes boredom with games. The other escapes exhaustion with dreams. And so you see, in the Middle Ages, time itself was currency. Nobles could spend it freely. Peasants had to beg, borrow, or steal a moment of it. The next morning, bells toll from a distant cloister, their chimes floating over fields still damp with dew. For a noble son, those bells might signal the beginning of a monastic life, quiet study, chanting, and safety behind stone walls. For a peasant, those same bells mean it's time to stop hoeing for a moment, cross yourself, and then get back to work. The divide isn't just in food or fashion, it's even in prayer. Step into the monastery cloister. The air smells of beeswax and parchment. A young noble boy, perhaps the spare son of a lord, kneels at a desk. He traces letters in a manuscript by candlelight, copying psalms in Latin, while monks glide silently behind him. He'll spend his days reading Augustine, learning theology, and perhaps rising to become an abbot or bishop, wielding both spiritual and political power. For him, devotion is a doorway to influence. Now slip into the village chapel. The roof leaks, the floor is dirt, and the air is thick with incense that barely masks the smell of unwashed bodies. A priest chants in Latin, a language the peasants don't understand. They cross themselves dutifully, mouthing prayers they cannot read. Their education in religion is mostly sermons, mystery plays at festivals, and colorful wall paintings showing saints, devils, and Judgment Day. For them, devotion is survival insurance. Do this or burn forever. Here's your mainstream fact. Monasteries were centers of learning and power, preserving manuscripts, cultivating medicinal herbs, and acting as landlords to vast estates. Monks often came from noble families, while peasants worked the monastic lands. Historians still argue whether monasteries were genuine refuges of charity or primarily engines of wealth cloaked in prayer. Quirky tidbit: some monasteries brewed beer not just for sustenance, but as a way to raise funds. In fact, monastic beer was considered safer than water, and in some regions became a prized product. Imagine peasants praying for salvation, while monks perfected brewing techniques that would eventually inspire Europe's love affair with ale. Religion also drew clear lines in death. Nobles commissioned tombs carved with angels, their effigies lying in eternal repose, hands folded in stone prayer. Their names and coats of arms glared from stained glass for centuries. Peasants, by contrast, were buried in unmarked plots, graves quickly reused when space ran out. In the long run, the earth treated both the same, but memory did not. Daily rhythm differed too. Monks followed the liturgy of the hours, prayers at dawn, mid-morning, noon, afternoon, evening, and midnight. Their day was punctuated by bells, balanced between work, study, and prayer. Peasants' day was one continuous blur of labor, with prayer snatched in whispers before meals or muttered as they swung scythes. Bells marked time for both, but one class heard them as a guide to contemplation, the other as a command to keep working. Joke break. If you were a peasant, you might think the monks had it easy, praying all day instead of plowing. But then you'd sit through 6-hour services in cold stone halls and realize even salvation requires stamina. The contrast runs into how religion explained suffering. Nobles heard sermons about charity and stewardship, reminding them to care for their peasants, though they rarely did more than the bare minimum. Peasants heard sermons telling them obedience and suffering were holy, that their reward awaited in heaven. Religion, in many ways, reinforced inequality, promising that the poor would feast in paradise if they endured on earth. Historians still debate whether peasants truly accepted this narrative or quietly resented it. Evidence suggests both. Some peasants clung to faith as their only hope. Others mocked priests in folk songs or joined heretical movements that promised equality before God. The tension between acceptance and rebellion simmered like incense smoke under vaulted ceilings. Another quirky tidbit: nobles sometimes kept private chapels inside their castles, hiring priests to say masses for the family's souls. Peasants, meanwhile, paid tithes, 1/10 of their harvest, to support the church, even when their families went hungry. Yes, even in devotion, poverty had taxes. As the bells fade, you see the picture clearly. Nobles sent sons to monasteries for learning, politics, and influence. Peasants sent sons into fields for labor and taxes. One class carved prayers into vellum, the other carved furrows into earth. Both lifted their eyes to heaven, but only one expected to be remembered in stone. You step into the manor courtyard just as a tax collector arrives, parchments tucked under his arm, a smirk already curling across his face. The Lord greets him warmly, knowing that today's collections will swell his coffers, not empty them. For nobles, war is a ladder. Conquest brings plunder, new lands, and even ransoms for captured rivals. For peasants, war is a pit. Every levy, every conscription, every harvest tithed away until their cupboards echo with nothing but air. Picture it. The noble raises banners, summons knights, and prepares for glory. Armor is polished, horses saddled, trumpets blare. Behind the fanfare, peasants shuffle forward to hand over grain, livestock, and coins. Sometimes they pay in labor, trudging miles to dig ditches or haul supplies for the army. Their role is not to fight, but to fund, and the fund is endless. Here's the mainstream fact. During the 100 Years' War, both England and France imposed relentless taxes to fund campaigns, poll taxes, hearth taxes, wool levies. These burdens fell hardest on peasants, sparking revolts like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Historians still argue whether these uprisings were spontaneous or carefully organized, but one thing is certain: taxation pushed the poor to the breaking point. Quirky tidbit: ransoming was so lucrative for nobles that some knights supposedly avoided killing wealthy enemies just to cash in later. Capturing a noble could be worth more than years of farming an estate. Meanwhile, a captured peasant? Worthless. No one paid ransom for a plowman. He was either executed or pressed into servitude. The contrast was literally life or death. Step into a peasant hut during wartime. The family sits counting what's left: a half sack of barley, 2 chickens, and a thin goat. The collector takes the barley, 1 chicken, and demands labor on the Lord's campaign. The family eats less, works more, and watches winter loom closer. In some cases, collectors even seized tools, leaving peasants unable to plant for the next year. Hunger became hereditary. Meanwhile, in the castle, the noble lady oversees preparations for the war feast. Tables groan with salted meats, wine casks roll in, and musicians are hired to celebrate the Lord's departure. War is wrapped in silk banners and toasted with goblets. The noble may return with new land or a richer marriage alliance. For him, war is investment. For his peasants, war is bankruptcy. Joke break. If you were a peasant and asked what you got out of war, the answer would be simple: poorer feet and fewer chickens. The divide deepens in aftermath. Victorious nobles gain castles, titles, and stories sung by minstrels. Peasants return to burned huts, trampled fields, and graves where neighbors once stood. Sometimes they never returned at all, conscripted, marched across countries, buried in unmarked soil. The chronicles list the lords who won and lost. The peasants' names vanish like smoke after battle. Historians still debate whether peasants saw taxation as unbearable theft or just the grim cost of existence. Some records suggest quiet compliance, others show violent uprisings. The 1381 rebels in London, for instance, stormed the Tower and executed officials, shouting for freedom. Their fury was real, but their revolt was crushed, their leaders hanged, and taxes soon resumed. Another quirky tidbit: nobles often demanded aid for personal reasons. Marriages, knighthoods, crusades. Imagine being told to hand over half your harvest because your lord's daughter wanted a more extravagant wedding dress. For peasants, war wasn't the only tax. Aristocratic vanity added its own invoice. By nightfall, the castle glows with torchlight as knights prepare to ride, their armor gleaming, their laughter loud. Down in the huts, darkness swallows the fields. Children whimper from hunger, and parents pray for rain that will fatten crops before the next levy drains them again. One class dreams of banners, the other of bread. And so you see, in the Middle Ages, war was not simply fought, it was financed. Nobles reaped profit, peasants paid the bill. The road stretches out before you, but notice how it changes depending on whose feet, or hooves, press it. For peasants, roads are mud paths choked with ruts, puddles, and the stench of dung. They connect field to village, and maybe, if you're lucky, village to market. For nobles, roads are arteries of trade, paved in some towns, lined with inns, patrolled by guards. They connect manor to castle, castle to city, and city to the distant glitter of foreign markets. Step into the castle hall during a merchant's visit. Crates are unpacked. Saffron from the east, cinnamon from Ceylon, silk from China, fine glassware from Venice. Nobles run their hands over bolts of fabric smoother than anything peasants could imagine. Inhale spices that smell like treasure. Sip wine that crossed seas. Exotic goods are more than luxuries. They are proof of power, visible reminders that wealth can shrink the world. Now, step into a peasant hut. The imports here are local. Turnips from the next field, clay pots from the village potter, wool spun by your own wife. Bread is baked in communal ovens, and ale is brewed in smoky hearths. The idea of cinnamon on porridge is as far-fetched as flying carpets. Peasants live in a world bounded by miles, while nobles live in a world stretched across continents. Here's your mainstream fact. The Silk Road and Mediterranean trade routes funneled luxuries into Europe, but only nobles and wealthy merchants could afford them. Common folk rarely tasted sugar or pepper. Historians still argue whether access to such goods genuinely transformed diets or simply reinforced status symbols. Quirky tidbit: peppercorns were so valuable they were nicknamed black gold. Rent, dowries, even bribes could be paid in pepper. Imagine a noble clinking a pouch of pepper as casually as coins. Meanwhile, a peasant sprinkled salt sparingly, if they had it at all, and prayed the fish didn't rot before it was eaten. Travel itself reinforced the gap. Nobles journeyed with escorts, banners, and letters of safe conduct. They lodged at abbeys, inns, or other castles, feasting along the way. Peasants walked to market with baskets slung on shoulders, sleeping in barns or hedgerows if the trip ran long. Bandits were a constant fear. A peasant robbed on the road could lose a year's livelihood in a single night. A noble robbed? He simply raised taxes to cover the loss. Joke break. A peasant saying, "I traveled abroad," usually meant, "I walked 2 villages over." A noble saying it meant, "I collected silk from Constantinople." Even infrastructure showed inequality. Roman roads, though crumbling, still carried noble carriages and mounted riders. Peasants slogged in mud lanes barely wide enough for a cart. Bridges were often toll points, affordable to nobles, ruinous to peasants. And if the toll couldn't be paid, peasants forded rivers, risking lives in cold currents while nobles crossed safely above. Markets offered brief glimpses of the divide. Nobles strode through stalls, buying dyed cloth, spices, and silver trinkets. Peasants bartered eggs for onions, wool for bread. Both stood in the same square, but one walked away with luxuries, the other with necessities. For peasants, markets were survival. For nobles, they were spectacle. Historians still debate whether medieval trade improved peasant life at all. Some argue cheap pottery, iron tools, and second-hand cloth trickled down and lightened daily burdens. Others insist the real benefits stopped at castle gates. Evidence exists for both. Archaeological finds of imported trinkets in humble homes suggest at least a taste of the wider world, though never the feast. Another quirky tidbit: wealthy nobles sometimes had sugar sculptures, yes, entire statues made of molded sugar, displayed at banquets, then eaten for dessert. Peasants barely saw sugar their whole lives. To them, a sugar statue would have seemed like sorcery. By dusk, the picture is plain. Yum. The noble road leads outward to trade, adventure, and wealth. The peasant road circles back, hut to field to hut again. One world expands, the other contracts. And every footprint left behind tells the same truth. The rich traveled on silk roads, the poor on dirt ones. You sit by the hearth as the winter wind rattles shutters. And once again, the contrast between rich and poor sharpens like frost on a window pane. For nobles, inheritance is a guarantee. A son inherits land, titles, rents, and the loyalty of vassals. For peasants, inheritance is a gamble. Divide a single strip of land among many children, and soon no one has enough to live on. The difference is generational security versus generational fragility. Step into the castle hall. The Lord summons scribes to draft charters, sealing documents with wax stamped by his signet ring. His eldest son is named heir. Younger sons may be sent to monasteries, knighted, or married into other estates. Daughters are portioned into marriage alliances, their dowries padded with land or gold. The family fortune grows like a tree, each branch strong enough to bear fruit for centuries. Even if war or plague claims one heir, the system ensures another rises. Now slip into a peasant hut. The father divides his strips of land among 3 sons. Each receives a piece so small it barely feeds a family. The daughters? They may marry out, carrying a small dowry and chickens, or a cow if fortune smiles. But often, poverty multiplies instead of diminishing. Some children become wandering laborers, seasonal workers moving from manor to manor, their futures tied not to ownership, but to survival. Here's your mainstream fact. Inheritance practices varied, but in much of Western Europe, primogeniture, eldest son inherits everything, dominated among nobles, ensuring estates stayed intact. Peasants, however, often followed partible inheritance, dividing land equally among heirs, which fragmented holdings into strips too narrow to sustain life. Historians still argue whether partible inheritance was community survival strategy or a curse that deepened poverty over generations. Quirky tidbit. In some regions, peasants were technically serfs, meaning they weren't even free to will their land to heirs without lordly approval. In extreme cases, the lord could claim the family cow or even the widow's best garment upon the peasant's death, a practice grimly called the Harriet. Imagine grieving and losing your cloak in the same week. Back in the castle, the lord's heir dons a new cloak trimmed with fur, his future secured by bloodlines. He need not worry about famine. Rents from peasants guarantee his table stays full. He dreams not of survival, but of expansion. More land, more titles, more alliances. His children will inherit more than property. They inherit power, expectation, and memory carved into stone tombs. In the hut, inheritance feels more like debt. Children inherit not only land, but also obligations, rents, tithes, taxes. A poor harvest could mean the family falls behind, and debt carries forward like a curse. Some sons leave to seek work as soldiers or craftsmen. Some daughters become servants in noble households. What is passed down is not stability, but vulnerability. Joke break. For nobles, inheritance comes with a feast. For peasants, inheritance comes with an empty field and 3 extra mouths to feed. And then there's famine. When harvests fail, nobles retreat to stored grain or purchase food at inflated prices, while peasants sell tools, animals, or even themselves into bonded labor just to survive the winter. Inheritance here isn't about wealth, it's about who lasts until spring. Historians still debate whether peasants saw hope in inheritance at all, or whether most assumed that younger children would drift away to serve elsewhere. Village records show both patterns. Some families clung for generations to tiny plots, others scattered like seeds on the wind. The noble line flourished in permanence. The peasant line survived in movement. Another quirky tidbit: noble wills often included lavish bequests to monasteries for masses to be sung for their souls. Peasants, by contrast, might leave behind a single candle or a sack of grain as their offering. Even in death, the difference lingered. One soul carried by chance in echoing cathedrals, another prayed for quietly in a village chapel. By the time the wind dies and the fire burns low, you see how inheritance defined the medieval divide. Nobles passed down castles, land, and power, securing legacies. Peasants passed down hunger, debt, and fields too narrow to support hope. One future widened with each generation. The other narrowed until it vanished into dust. The church bells toll slowly at dusk, and you find yourself walking behind a funeral procession. Death, in the Middle Ages, is the one thing everyone shares, yet even in death, the treatment of rich and poor is worlds apart. Start in the castle. A nobleman lies in state, his body washed, anointed with oils, and dressed in finery. Priests chant solemn masses, candles blaze in silver holders, and mourners file past tapestries depicting saints and angels. When the time comes, his coffin, ornately carved and lined with cloth, will be carried into a church crypt or a family chapel, resting under a sculpted effigy that ensures he is remembered for centuries. Visitors will whisper his name as they read inscriptions in Latin, and prayers will be said for his soul at regular intervals. Inheritance guarantees not just wealth, but memory. Now step into the village graveyard. A peasant's body is wrapped in a simple shroud of rough cloth, lowered into the earth in an unmarked grave. No stone, no inscription. Often no coffin at all, just soil shoveled quickly because another body waits. Children cry softly, but life presses on. Fields need plowing, animals need feeding, and grief must be swallowed to make room for survival. Within a generation, the grave is forgotten, reused, the bones mingling with countless others who lived and died in silence. Here's your mainstream fact. Noble tombs became landmarks, elaborate monuments inside cathedrals and churches, while peasant burials were humble and often temporary. Archaeological digs show layers of reused graves, peasants stacked one above another in earth that kept no names. Historians still argue whether ordinary people found comfort in this anonymity as a sign of humility before God, or whether they quietly resented how the wealthy claimed eternity in stone. Quirky tidbit: some nobles had tombs designed with transy effigies, statues showing their bodies as rotting corpses beneath their regal likeness, a dramatic reminder that even lords turned to dust. It was a strange blend of humility and pride. Yes, I'll rot like you, but I'll rot in marble. Death rituals themselves carried inequality. Nobles paid for dozens of masses to speed their souls through purgatory, endowing chantries where priests would pray endlessly in their name. Peasants might scrape together a coin for a single candle, trusting that God's mercy was free even if priests' prayers were not. The divide was spiritual economics, souls measured in how much gold you could spend on salvation. The sensory divide strikes you again. In the castle chapel, the air is thick with incense, organ notes swell, and mourners in velvet weep into perfumed cloths. In the village graveyard, the smell is fresh-turned earth, the sound is crows and shovels, and mourners wipe tears with the backs of calloused hands. Both mourners pray to the same God, but one believes their loved one is escorted to heaven by choirs. The other hopes their soul simply finds rest. Joke break. In the Middle Ages, peasants could joke that nobles had two lives, the one on earth and the one carved in stone. Peasants had one life, and the stone belonged to someone else. And yet, peasants found ways to keep memory alive. Songs, stories, and oral traditions carried names longer than any marble. A village might pass down a tale of a grandfather who fought bravely in a levy, or a mother who saved her family during famine. Their legacy was not written on church walls, but spoken by firelight, carried in the rhythm of daily work. Historians still debate how peasants viewed noble tombs. Were they symbols of awe, reminders of divine order, or quiet irritations? Some chronicles hint at resentment, noting riots where tombs were defaced during uprisings. Others suggest peasants found comfort in the idea that at least someone's prayers filled the air, even if not their own names. Another quirky tidbit: burial shrouds sometimes had tiny bells sewn into them to prevent premature burial. The fear of being buried alive haunted both nobles and peasants. Nobles could afford the bells. Peasants relied on hope and quick neighbors with sharp ears. By nightfall, the graveyards fall silent, but the divide remains. Nobles sleep under carved angels. Peasants sleep under bare earth. Both return to dust, but only one is remembered by name. And as you walk away, you realize that even death in the Middle Ages was an extension of life's inequality. Stone for the rich, silence for the poor. The church bells rise again at dawn, and this time they don't call for labor or mourning, but for worship. Across fields and forests, both nobles and peasants gather in churches, yet even here, in the one place meant to equalize all souls, the divide between rich and poor lingers like incense in the rafters. Step into the castle chapel first. The lord and lady kneel on cushioned prie-dieu, their gowns shimmering with embroidery, their cloaks trimmed in fur. A private priest chants Mass, his voice echoing against carved stone, while stained glass windows paint halos of color over the noble family. Their prayers are accompanied by organ tones and the rustle of silken sleeves. And after service, the priest blesses them privately, perhaps reminding them that their generous donations to the church will speed their souls toward heaven. For nobles, religion is privilege, complete with a reserved seat in eternity's waiting room. Now step into the village church. The air is damp, the floor packed earth or rough planks, and the benches creak under the weight of weary bodies. The priest chants in Latin, words the peasants don't understand but mimic through gestures. Their offering, a basket of eggs, a sheaf of wheat, or a single coin if fortune allows. Their reward, the faint hope that obedience will save them from damnation. No stained glass here, just whitewashed walls decorated with painted devils and angels, reminders that hellfire is closer than comfort. Here's your mainstream fact. The medieval church was one of the greatest unifiers and dividers at once. Nearly everyone, rich or poor, was baptized, married, and buried by its rites. Yet the experience was stratified. Nobles funded cathedrals, controlled appointments, and received special masses, while peasants bore tithes, fasting rules, and sermons that stressed obedience. Historians still argue whether the church was more a spiritual refuge for peasants or a tool of control wielded by elites. Quirky tidbit: some nobles commissioned indulgences, documents granting remission of sins in exchange for donations. A peasant might live a life of laborious piety and still fear purgatory, while a wealthy noble could, quite literally, buy a shortcut to heaven. Imagine standing in the same church, hearing the same sermon, but realizing salvation itself carried a price tag. Even in ritual, the gulf appeared. At communion, nobles might drink wine from chalices of silver. Peasants received bread alone, sometimes from the same loaf, but never the same cup. Nobles knelt closest to the altar. Peasants clustered at the back. Even within God's house, seating was destiny. The sensory difference is sharp. In the castle chapel, incense, velvet, candlelight glowing on polished brass. In the village church, smoke, wool, children crying, the sour smell of damp cloaks. The noble prays with ease, knowing the priest is family ally. The peasant prays with desperation, begging for rain or healing. Joke break: if you were a peasant listening to Latin Mass, you might whisper, "For all I know, Father just cursed my cow." And yet, religion was also where peasants found moments of equality. Festivals transformed the village. Processions, dancing, and mystery plays brought laughter. For a brief time, nobles and peasants knelt together, even if afterward the nobles feasted while peasants drank thin ale. Faith gave meaning to toil, and hope that the next life would reverse this one's injustice. Historians still debate whether peasants believed heaven would truly level the field. Some sources suggest deep faith in divine justice. Others hint at cynicism, that heaven's promises were as uneven as earthly laws. But even if doubt lingered, church bells still called, and peasants still came. Sometimes faith itself was the only inheritance they could claim. Another quirky tidbit: sermons often included vivid tales of hell, with devils dragging sinners into fiery pits. For peasants, these stories were terrifying but also entertaining. Medieval horror films delivered weekly. For nobles, the same sermons became gentle reminders to donate more gold to the church. As you step out of the church, the bells fade, and the world resumes its divide. Nobles ride back to their castles. Peasants trudge back to their fields. Both glance upward to the same sky, whispering prayers to the same God, yet walking lives so unequal that only heaven itself could promise balance. And with that final thought, your long walk through medieval inequality draws to its close. You've seen huts and castles, famine and feasts, rags and velvet, gallows and pardons, superstition and scholarship, bare feet and war horses, forgotten graves and marble tombs. Every step revealed the same truth. In the Middle Ages, class was destiny. But you've also seen laughter, stories, and resilience among the poor, reminding you that even in the darkest ages, humanity found ways to shine. Now your eyes grow heavy. The bells grow softer, as if rung by angels far away. And soon, whether rich or poor, you'll join the same quiet kingdom of sleep. The journey is over now. You've walked the muddy lanes and climbed the stone steps. You've sat in smoky huts and stood in echoing halls. You've felt the weight of hunger and the heaviness of velvet, the hush of prayer and the roar of battle. And yet, here in this moment, none of it matters anymore. The castles fade, the fields blur, the bells grow distant. What remains is only quiet. Breathe deeply. Let the air feel cool and steady, like the night breeze slipping through a window. Each breath is slower than the last, each exhale longer, softer, easier. You are no longer trudging barefoot through mud or carrying burdens on your shoulders. You are lying safely where you are, weight sinking into the bed or chair beneath you. Picture a small candle flickering in a chapel corner. Its flame bends gently, steady but never hurried. That flame is your breath, small, warm, enough to keep the darkness friendly. Around you, stone walls vanish into mist, huts dissolve into stars. You are between worlds, neither poor nor rich, simply still. The stories of nobles and peasants can rest now. Their struggles are folded away like manuscripts on a shelf, waiting for another day. You don't need to carry their battles or their hunger. You only need to carry sleep. Your eyelids are heavier than chainmail, softer than down. Let your body unclench, from your toes to your chest, from your shoulders to your face. Each part loosens like earth after rain. You drift weightless, beyond the reach of bells, beyond the toll of taxes, beyond even the memory of difference. There is only rest. And now, let yourself slip into that rest, sweet, quiet, timeless.